I do have some screen caps that are pretty dense, and they don't come out quite crisply on this screen, but that's okay. I could talk through them. My name is Bill Showie. I am an Atlanta resident, almost a native now I could call myself, because I've been here for well over 20 years. I work for a firm called MediaCurrent. MediaCurrent is a firm that performs Drupal development, but more than Drupal development, provides elegantly designed web experiences that deliver strategic impact. MediaCurrent, even though headquartered here, has employees all over the US. We are a virtual company. Myself, I've been involved with Drupal in different capacities for about 10 years as a developer and as a solution architect, and now currently as a business analyst. So what I do now is more client-facing, requirements elicitation, requirements analysis, and also now and then competitive analysis. And one of my tasks in doing this competitive analysis was to look at the leading content management solutions out there and see the pros and cons of each, see how Drupal stacks up with each. Before I go on, I do want to address the elephant in the room, and that is that I am a Drupal fanboy. I've been with Drupal for 10 years. I am biased. As someone as biased, both in the blog posts I've written that support this and a white paper I've written that support this material, I tried to be as objective as possible. The best way I could think of doing that was just look at specific aspects of each and just be honest whether this other technology beats Drupal in some narrow aspect. So let's take a look at those aspects. For 2 years running, Gartner Research has published its Magic Quadrant of leaders in the CMS field. For 2 years running, the 3 leaders have been the same: Drupal, Adobe Enterprise Manager, AEM, and Sitecore. So let's take a look at how those 3 compare to one another across these 5 perspectives, from the content author, from the marketer, from the business perspective, IT, and then finally the community perspective. Before I get into that, I want to give credit to the sources where I got a lot of my information from. Of course, Gartner itself. I spent a lot of time looking at Adobe's documentation, Sitecore's documentation. There were also some great presentations at the past 2 DrupalCons. One was by Angie Byron, who compared these 3 plus a few more. I definitely recommend you check that out. And that was done last year. I forget which of the cities. I believe it was the Dublin one, but I don't remember. And then Dries, his last 2 DrupalCon keynotes get into a lot of the features that have recently been developed for Drupal, which shore up Drupal's previous weaknesses. Let's first talk about the perspective from the content author. In this area, Adobe is the one that shines. And the reason being is that AEM was designed with content authors in mind. We're getting a little bit too much ambient noise here. Can we close these 2 doors? And so with content authors in mind, there are things like drag and drop editing, in-place editing, dynamic layouts. There's a hook behind the door, on the other side of the door, toward the floor. With all these things, drag and drop editing, in-place editing, in-place layouts, those things were prioritized first in the development of what used to be called Day software, then Adobe CQ, now called AEM. So taking a look at drag and drop editing, for example, AEM provides a handy bar on the side that contains text, images, videos, other media that one can simply drag and drop into the edit area. Sitecore was behind, but caught up somewhat in providing a somewhat similar user interface, maybe more text heavy, a little less graphical assist, but still that same drag and drop principle. While Adobe and Sitecore were featuring those things, Drupal was still in this stage. A big monolithic body in edit mode, well behind. And the Drupal community knew it. And has taken some measures to catch up. What you're seeing here is a feature of Acquia Lift. This is an add-on to Drupal for a licensing fee that provides that same graphical drag and drop that you saw with Adobe. But there's a licensing fee for that. Is there an open source way to do that too? And slowly, the Drupal community is getting there. This is a feature add-on to the quick edit module called image drag and drop, where a user can take an image from the desktop, drag over an existing image in the browser, and immediately swap an image in place. So although not at parity with Adobe, the Drupal community is getting there. They're aware of this disparity with that feature. The story with granular content editing is somewhat similar. Again, reusing the same image as before, the authoring interface for AEM did start out with the ability for content authors to more granularly move around and edit smaller pieces of content, images, videos, etc. Sitecore is somewhat similar. This is a bad screenshot. Most of the action actually happens below the fold here. This was the one I could best find. But similarly, it does deal with those small granular pieces of content. Before I show Drupal, there is just one quick change of subject I want to bring up now, because I'm going to bring it up later too. Look at this area on the left. It looks just like Windows Explorer, doesn't it? That's not by accident. Sitecore is explicitly designed for Windows shops. It's a nice selling point that if you're a Windows shop, your transition into Sitecore will be seamless. Okay, back to the topic at hand. Again, while AEM had that nice granular editing interface, Drupal was still in the monolithic body phase. One big monolithic body. Yes, there's some CK or WYSIWYG editing that can be done there, but certainly not the level of flexibility that you could get with AEM. As Drupal evolved with around Drupal 6 or Drupal 7, I forget now, but the notion of fields came in. So you could add above and beyond the body different fields, text fields, image fields, video fields, etc. That's nice. But after that, the paragraphs module was developed. Think of paragraphs as something like a body field, but multiple body fields that have every bit of the granularity that you see in AEM, including the ability to swap them, the ability to make them any type you want, but I would argue has leapfrogged AEM in this regard, in that it's not only basic types of content you could put in a paragraph, but you could get atypical things like Drupal views, if you're familiar with Drupal views. Another nice thing about paragraphs is that the paragraphs themselves are fieldable. So think of the nesting of content. And sometimes clients ask for that, deeply nested content. And using the paragraph module lends itself so easily to that. And that's why at Media Current we use it so often. In-place editing, somewhat of a similar story. Here's an example of AEM, where the AEM content author looks directly at the page in view mode, but since he or she has edit access, they can double click on a field and edit it in place. Sitecore was behind, but has caught up to AEM. Again, the ability to double click on a field and edit it in place. The GUI is a little different, but the principle is the same. Drupal was not there, but has caught up with the quick edit module. And this is from one of our demos. Again, double click on it, edit in place, and from what I showed a few slides ago, now the ability to drag images in, to swap images, to swap an image in place without having to leave the screen and go into edit mode. Content groupings. It's kind of debatable whether this is a content authoring task, the ability to aggregate and group content for display. But with some solutions, that's what some clients need, the ability for the content author to do that. So with AEM, it's typically dragging and dropping content from a list to a bucket, as you could see here. And what the result is, you have some lovely grouping of content. That's good enough, but Sitecore goes deeper. You could see here that the way to group site content in Sitecore is a lot like an advanced search. You type in search fields, you get search facets, search results are dynamically displayed, and the content author can save that search for automatic display to the end user. Sitecore provides further shortcuts, these pre-baked advanced search widgets, search by other, return results up to date, etc. So it goes deeper than AEM. All that said, this is one of those areas where Drupal was way ahead early on and still is way ahead. Views. Good old views, which has been around forever. Yes, it is ridiculously complex for a content author to use, maybe too powerful for a content author to use, but the power is there if the client wants it. Sitemap. To create a sitemap in AEM out of box is a lovely thing. It provides the tools to create a graphical sitemap showing nesting intuitively. I could not find one for Sitecore, but for Drupal, the sitemap module, all it produces is just a block of text that is nested. That block of text can be prettied up with CSS. There's a CSS library called Slickmap, which can produce something that looks like this, but it does not yet approach the out-of-box sitemap capability that AEM has. Layout management. Anybody here use Wix or Squarespace or any of those? Yeah, I'm a Squarespace user. So there are these online website builders that provide intuitive tools to really format your site to your liking. And AEM provides a Wix-like functionality to set the layout of a page. Here in a grid format, one, without leaving the page, can dynamically expand and contract rows and columns, set the number of rows and columns, all very intuitively. This is way ahead of what is what Sitecore is capable of and what Drupal is capable of as well. So here with Sitecore, you could see you have to leave the page and you have to manually set what your columns and rows are and the pixel widths of each. With Drupal, oh sorry, this is still Sitecore. There's also a splitter module in Sitecore that will allow you to dynamically, well, not dynamically, but change the width of columns after they're done with that previous GUI. With Drupal, this is a display of the layout module. Again, you'd have to leave the screen in order to set rows and columns and how certain page elements span rows and columns. With Drupal in Display Suite, one can see taking a page element and placing it in a region on a page, and also in Display Suite for a content type, you could choose any one of a set of predetermined layouts. But again, all of this activity occurs off view mode. And this was an animated GIF of panels that is not showing up. But panels is another way to deal with layout, and probably one of the closest ways we have in the Drupal community of doing layout management in place, in view mode. The ability to look at columns, change layouts while in view mode, drag page elements from one region to another in view mode. But as much as that works, it's still not as intuitive as what AEM offers. So long story short, for content authoring, AEM was developed that way, it was envisioned that way, and still is, in my view, the leader in that perspective, although the other two have made great strides to catch up. And in the case of Drupal, leapfrog it in a couple of areas. Changing the subject now to a marketer's perspective, however, this is where Sitecore really shines. Just as AEM was created with content authors being the priority, Sitecore was created with marketers being a priority. Marketers and, of course, Windows Shop. So with campaigns and personalization, this is all out of box with Sitecore. The ability to create a campaign much as you would in Marketo or Pardot. Only you're not spending additional licensing fees to do that. This all starts inside of Sitecore. And once campaigns are created, of course, tracking how a campaign is doing is also out of box in Sitecore. Further, Sitecore has in the equivalent in Drupal would be the rules module or perhaps actions and triggers. Only with Sitecore, it's out of box and is built into practically everything. It's very natural and intuitive to track really any click the user makes on any device. And further, with its personalization component, and we can, I suppose, discuss the ethics of this after the session, but Sitecore will even track what a user does at brick and mortar stores if it's configured to do that, and tie that into that same user's activity on the user's mobile devices or on the user's web browser, and very quickly can build up a very detailed, very rich profile for that user and act on it, all out of box. And of course, provide dashboards to track everything that goes on there. But with AEM, none of that comes out of box. Adobe does offer Marketing Cloud, which is a separate product. It requires an additional licensing fee to use, but like Sitecore, does observe and adapt to users' behaviors and performs analytics. That's as deep as I was able to get in looking at Adobe Marketing Cloud. With Drupal being a content management system first and purposefully small in core when it started, it had little of those features out of box. However, as a large open source platform, integrates well with best of breed marketing automation platforms like your Pardot and Marketos. Personalization using the rules module actually can accomplish a great deal. probably not the extent that Sitecore can, say, in monitoring what a user does in a brick and mortar store, unless a lot of custom development happens to make that work. Drupal will integrate with Google Analytics. There's a long, stable Google Analytics module that brings that in. And then there are proprietary add-ons for Drupal as well, including Acquia Lift, which does a lot of the campaigns and personalization that we saw with Sitecore. Finally, one word about e-commerce. There seems to be parity among the three with their e-commerce capabilities. None of them have e-commerce out of box. They all require add-ons to do it. With AEM, there's Adobe's Commerce Engine. With Sitecore, there's a technology called Sitecore Commerce. Both of those require licensing fees. And with Drupal, we could use Drupal Commerce, or for a licensing fee, Acquia Commerce Manager, or Magento, or any other best-of-breed e-commerce solution. Switching the topic to business perspective. One of the elephant in the room questions is how much do these things cost? I was kind of undecided on whether to discuss this here. Reason being is organizations like to keep their costs as private as they can. The cost from 1 year ago might be a lot different than the cost now. And thirdly, costs are negotiable. So they might vary from client to client. So I present these costs with the disclaimer that these are not set in stone. For AEM, the information I did find is that the average licensing deal for AEM is in the mid-6 figures. Plus implementation cost can be over $1 million. So that's a lot, but large enterprises like RCS and Skylark Group and Frankie decide to make that plunge. I'm sure everybody has their different reasons for doing so, but one reason could be the content department has decision power. And if they want something that is most friendly for content authoring, I can see why somebody would want to make that investment. In contrast, Sitecore, it too has substantial licensing costs, but not to the level of AEM. Mid-5 figures for the first year of licensing costs, plus a high 4 figures for each additional year. Implementation costs start in the mid-5 figures, and support and miscellaneous will cost about $10K a year. In contrast, of course, we know that the licensing cost for Drupal is free. Moreover, with implementation options, the various development service companies that are out there, and hosting options that are out there, there is a wide range of prices for that. Finally, there are additional licensing fees for some of the add-ons, like some of the Acquia products. Yes?
Do you have a number for Sitecore implementation? Or I just missed it.
How do you go backwards in Google Sheets? Up arrow?
Left arrow.
Oh, I did up arrow.
Okay. Oh, there it is. All right, I just missed it.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. The managing partner for Media Current, Dave Terry, is in the room. Everybody give Dave a hand. Dave and I had a chat a while back. 10 years ago, when I was starting with Drupal, I had read an article in Forrester claiming that open source solutions like Drupal were at a major disadvantage to proprietary solutions, despite their free licensing cost. The disadvantage being that a client always knows who is on the other side of the phone when something goes wrong. They have access, if they want, to the very developer who wrote that errant line of code. So they felt secure in that whatever went wrong, they could have fixed. I had asked Dave, in his 10 years with MediaCurrent, what trend he has seen. I mean, I'm sure he was seeing it 10 years ago, but is he seeing it as much now? Can you talk to that, Dave?
Yeah, I mean, I think the conversation we were having is kind of what are the business driver decisions compared to the early days of Drupal. And what's interesting, you would know the polling and like the surveying better than I would, but the paradigm has definitely shifted to I'm choosing Drupal and open source because of the perception that it's cheaper in the cost and there's no licensing, versus now what's driving the decision is much more the ability of Drupal to be flexible, the customization, and that perception versus if I go with proprietary, there's vendor lock-in, there's having to wait for a new release before I can integrate with maybe the latest and greatest social media widget. One of my favorite stories is like when a lot of the social sites started to explode, Facebook, for instance, there was literally a module within 24 hours available from the contrib community. Getting that same module in Adobe, or that same plugin would have taken a year and a half. There's just a release cycle and so it's interesting. It's definitely the other business decision that's pivoted is much more to your earlier slides from technology to marketing kind of, driving the decision. So, but yeah, it's the people, the organizations that are choosing Drupal, I don't think are as concerned about cost. The other big inherent advantage, though, that the Adobes have is there is a lot of brand awareness already, especially with like content administrators. So when the business decision comes up, they've heard of Photoshop. They already use, Adobe products. They haven't heard of Drupal. So there's much more of a, of a pitch and process to get that buy-in at the leadership level. So.
Are you finding another factor with clients being that 10 years ago, there were no famous enterprise-level Drupal solutions.
Yeah.
But now we have Sony, we have Weather Channel, we have Net Mutual, etc. So, and of course the federal government level websites. So given all that snowballing reputation, has that allayed the concerns?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely helped. And I mean, I tell this to everyone at MediaCurrent, and you just hit the nail on the head. What truly differentiates one product, one person, one company from another is reputation. So I think reputation is usually solidified by use cases. Like, so the only thing that can differentiate reputation is we have a track record that precedes us. Drupal has a track record. And if that track record includes brands that I've heard of, I'm a lot more likely to, adopt than, geez, no one else in my vertical is using Drupal. I don't want to be the first. So it's with the enterprises and the bigger names that have adopted Drupal, it certainly helps.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Dave. How are we doing on time? I don't have my watch.
It's 3:01.
Okay, great, thanks. Alrighty, let's take a IT perspective. You can see here the skills for each are quite different. At the highest level, they're the same. Your HTML, JavaScript, CSS. On the Adobe side, at lower levels in the technology stack, Adobe employs OSGi framework and Apache Sling. These are actually open source technologies with, of course, the proprietary wrapper around them. With Sitecore, hey, remember when I said Sitecore is friendly to Windows shops? you look at this list of technologies under Sitecore, these are Windows, Microsoft technologies. So really Windows friendly through and through. And of course on the Drupal slide, most of us are already familiar with this list of technologies. So we can segue into AEM's architecture. For those here not from a technology background, for the most part, digital solutions are based on a stack of technologies, one on top of the other, at the lowest level being a server, above that being some kind of data repository, and then above that being some kind of application or set of applications. The thing that interests me the most in comparing these three is where and how content is stored, because they have such a big impact on performance and scalability. Of course, each layer does, but I found myself most interested in how and where content was stored. In the case of AEM, how they store content is very different than how Sitecore and Drupal does it. Sitecore and Drupal are really kindred. Under the covers, they both use relational databases. That is, one is required to define the structure of data. And once that structure is defined, one can make very deep, complex, rich queries off of that data. In contrast, the data layer in AEM, the CRX content repository, can be done one of two ways. One is a set of tar files, and the other is using a NoSQL database, for example, MongoDB. What that means is it's a database that doesn't require you to set up the structure of the data beforehand. One can set it on the fly, and it provides a set of pros and cons in the ability to do that. One of the pros is much quicker input and output from that database. And another pro is the ability to horizontally scale more easily than we can with Sitecore and Drupal. The con to such a solution is consistency between servers. If you have multiple servers serving that data, usually for less than a second, if data changes on one server, it does not change on the other until some time elapses. With Sitecore, like I said, it's kindred to Drupal. At the data layer, it uses a standard relational database. Unlike Drupal, Sitecore requires 3 relational databases: master, web, and core. Master contains all content or all versions of content. Web contains only the most recent revisions of content, and that's for more immediate storage and immediate caching. And core contains configuration for the Sitecore solution. In contrast, with Drupal, typically content and configuration is all stored in one database. Otherwise, it's quite similar to how Sitecore is stacked up. All 3 are extendable. If you remember from a few slides ago, one of the blocks in the AEM diagram was OSGi. That's an open source framework that allows some very high level access to almost all of the elements on the AEM stack. AEM does have a development community. It's not a very large one. The number of AEM extensions, last time I checked, which was I think about 2 months ago, was about 300. In contrast, Sitecore, very similarly, it has a development community. It opens that development to really anybody who wants to extend Sitecore, but that community as well is small. The number of extensions for Sitecore is about 800. As Drupalists, we of course know that the number of extensions for Drupal in modules alone is significantly more. I took this screenshot, I think, maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago. 38,000 modules for Drupal. So compare 300 to 800 to 32,000. And that's where we are. With Drupal 8 alone, there are already 3,200 modules out there. A word on security. All three allow for fine-grained access for users and groups. AEM has a nice extra. The language for the front end for AEM is called HTML, which stands for HTML template language. And it prevents automatically any cross-site scripting vulnerability. That's a security plus to AEM. AEM also has a security minus in that its Sling layer does have some security vulnerabilities if you're not following best practices. And this site here lists what those vulnerabilities are. Sitecore has, I wouldn't call them vulnerabilities, but I will say a challenge in its data layer. From what I described a few slides back, it requires 3 databases. And so there is just more to account for in locking down those 3 databases rather than the one you would have with Drupal. More on performance and scalability. I had already talked about the MongoDB repository and how that can more easily horizontally scale, but at the price of data consistency. And also complexity. Both Sitecore and Drupal using relational databases, and as we saw from that views interface, does allow for more easy targeted access to data. Last slide, community perspective. The Drupal community is over 1 million people strong worldwide. And that's evidenced by the number of modules we saw. 32,000 versus 300 versus 800. Dave brought up some great instances of what that means. It means that with 1 million passionate people who are contributing code, documentation, design assets, and more, there really is no solution that we can't tackle, and quickly. Moreover, there is, with an open source solution, no vendor lock-in. If a client hires a proprietary vendor and the client, for whatever reason, can't get along with that vendor, if the arrangement doesn't work out, the client has nowhere else to go. And the same is not true in the open source community. Also, with such a large community, the pool of developers and other talented people is enormous. So it's much easier to find a Drupal developer with PHP or Symfony skills than it is a Sitecore developer or an AEM developer. And finally, there's just the passion. If there are 100 or 1 million people around, many of whom are contributing so much and doing nothing getting nothing in return other than the reward of doing something they love, that's a great bunch of people to be around. So if there's one thing I ask you to remember about all of this that we covered, is that all 3 technologies started from a very different place, really with different audiences in mind. AEM with content authors, Sitecore with marketers, and Drupal really started with developers in mind. But the lines between the 3 have blurred. You could see how one is catching up to the other in pretty much each of these 5 perspectives, except for the size of the community. All right, thanks everybody. I appreciate it. Okay, we have some time for Q&A if anybody has any questions.
Yes.
So, have you heard of any changes in the federal government's enthusiasm for open source, or specifically Drupal? Just as we're comparing different CMSs, I've wondered if the change in administrations might affect the adoption of open source. And I don't know if you're supposed to.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that, except to say that to my knowledge, there's nothing new that has started at the federal level in the past 9 months. Am I wrong about that? Does anybody know?
in DC.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the Drupal community there. I haven't seen any major change. I think procurement has slowed down from the uncertainty of who's going to win last year and the uncertainty of who's got a job there this year. I think stuff has slowed down, but I don't think there's been a sea change. I know there was a open comment period on open source technology. I can't remember the agency, just a few weeks ago, and Oracle, Oracle's here, basically submitted some stuff right out of 2001 anti-open source FUD. It was just almost hilarious, and all I saw on the internet was people mocking how could anyone still believe, that open source is inherently less secure than commercial software at this point. So I don't think there's been a major change.
Yeah, that was the source of my question, was those Oracle comments.
I'll answer your question with a question, and that is, I know with other government agencies, they kind of operate in that mode all the time. Like an agency like NASA, like the year before somebody gets elected president, they might tighten their budget because they don't know what's going to happen next. But is that different with agencies that develop recovery.gov and data.gov and whitehouse.gov?
Might you know?
I know there was some uncertainty at 18F
Yeah.
because there was some talk of them being eliminated, but I have a friend that works there, and it's kind of been no news is good news for the last 6 months.
Yeah.
Everything's just business as normal.
Yeah, we do some work with some government. I work for Tech, so we do some translation with them, and we kind of saw that, when we were talking about renewals and things. Like, can we hold off? But we haven't seen cancellations. Things are still just moving forward. Like, they're not expanding that I know of right now, but it's also not going away.
Yeah.
I'm seeing similar trends as well in my dealings with I'm up in Canada or in DC. The government stuff is just kind of slowed down. Frankly, it's like from the Canadian side, it's like we're just waiting to see what your president does. Yeah. But
Bill,
there's a general slowdown.
Maybe you could expound on the security aspect of it, because that's one of my, frustrations or one of the things that makes me perplexed is there's still this perception that proprietary is more secure than open source. And
Just through obfuscation.
yeah, exactly.
Right.
And it's just what people don't realize is when there's a virus with Sitecore or Adobe, or there's you said it like a pool, a very small pool, you have to try to figure out a fix for that virus, and the cycle to fix it can sometimes take months or years.
Right.
Whereas Drupal has a huge community that
And
can
a
immediately
dedicated
apply a
support
patch. Right.
Security group.
Yeah, and it's just though the message that gets out is that, well, the code is locked down, so Adobe must be more secure. And
Right.
I don't know if you found anything in your research.
Well, you've pretty much nailed it, except that maybe it's easier to defend Drupal because now of its track record with large government sites, right? Like whitehouse.gov. We don't want that hacked, right? Data.gov, recovery.gov. We don't want those things hacked. And so, that could be.
I have literally said whitehouse.gov is on Drupal. It's good enough for them, good enough for you. I have literally said that to people.
Right. So that using a Gartner distribution, and of course having a full-time set of security experts in the Drupal community who are there to react. I don't know if anybody has a story on maybe how quickly that team has turned around when a new security threat has come out, but less than a day, right? So yeah, I mean, it's really, really difficult to do at Adobe or Sitecore.
The side to think about there, it's not necessarily like the fastest security team always, or things like that, because it could take a little while sometimes, because it does take a little bit of time to find or fix those patches sometimes still.
Yes.
But there's still the earnest of that others are going to be looking at that, and it's going to be out in the open sooner. Whereas you look at a proprietary system, you have the obscurity, obfuscation side of things, but there's, if you're in a company like Adobe, what's the reason and what's your reason to want to disclose those security needs? Why not just keep them hidden as long as you can?
Yeah.
You don't have a tangible reason to do that, where in the open source side, someone's going to find that and it's going to come out much quicker, and you're going to have to fix that much quicker because you can't hide it. You can't stay in the trenches forever on that.
Sure.
You have that that tangible side where you have to stay with this from the beginning and keep up with that. And we as implementers and users of the software as well have the opposite side of that, to also stay up to date on applying the security patches for our clients, for our companies, for our enterprises, because it is out there. People know about that. You can't just say, oh, no one's going to know this is there. They're going to find it, and they're going to exploit that for you as well. So you have to also stay up on it as well.
Mm-hmm.
So I was recently in a demo with Sitecore with our marketing department. What got the most amount of attention in the demo was the marketing automation piece, where it's able to track campaigns, where you're able to build campaigns internally and adjust the user experience on the fly. Our marketing team loved that. Could you go into a little more detail about how we could accomplish something similar in Drupal?
I could partially go into that, because I don't have a whole lot of experience implementing such things. But I will say some of it can be done at the open source level, and then some at the proprietary level. At the open source level, simply using the actions and triggers module and the rules module, which are both free, actually allow for quite powerful and flexible profile building and adapting to a profile as a user behaves, as a user clicks on things in the browser or using a mobile device, or with extra development at a brick and mortar store. Beyond the open source level, there are proprietary solutions. One could argue perhaps even superior solutions, and that is the ability to easily integrate with best of breed solutions like a Marketo or Pardot. Oh, there was one more thing. Another proprietary add-on would be Acquia Lift, which if you've seen Acquia's promotional materials on Lift, it actually looks like Sitecore in how it behaves. I mean, not GUI-wise, but just how it behaves. The ability to track users across the spectrum of devices they use, the ability to track users even outside of the digital realm and adapt to how users behave. But now we're getting into proprietary solutions.
I was going to ask how MediaCurrent does it, because I know I have read blog posts on MediaCurrent and gotten emails the next day on on that same subject.
I was going to add into that side of it for you. So that's a perfect question for it. With that side of it, what Bill hit on, I don't think he emphasized it enough, is that with Sitecore, you get that marketing automation out of the box with Sitecore. Mm-hmm. With Drupal, you can take the best of breed. I think that's the part that really you need to look at, and the emphasization of it. If you're just going into it and you're just getting started and you're already using Sitecore, use their marketing, use their system that's there. It's a great way to get started in. If you're in Drupal already and you're on Acquia already, use Lift. You're already there. You're already heading in that direction. But what we see in a lot of our clients and things of that nature is they're already on Pardot. They're already on Salesforce especially. They're using Salesforce in all their CRM sides. They want to stay within that realm. So when we can take Drupal and integrate with that, with the Salesforce personalization tools and that side of it, that is a big win as you're going forward from that perspective. For the MediaCurrent side, we're using Pardot all the way through on that side of it. All of our forms and things are based on that and tracking through that side of it. Yeah. So even ourselves internally at the company get tracked on that side and get random emails back here and there, even though we get excluded on a lot of that. But yeah. There's a lot of great things, and I would actually say for more on that side, outside is Shelly Hutchins. She did a lot of the implementation of that initially,
Okay.
of how to set all that up, and she can get a lot in depth in some of those sides of it.
So I gotta chime in on the CRM stuff. It's really important to mention City CRM
Yeah.
because so that's open source CRM that is, let's not say tightly coupled, but closely coupled to Drupal. When visually I can describe this as you can have Drupal and you can have Salesforce and you build the communication layer. Civi CRM is PHP driven as Symfony, and it kind of sits inside of Drupal with an overlay of like 10 or 20% of the functionality. The best example would be that if you use Civi CRM, your user profiles are exposed to views. And you can leverage views to look at that data. It's very powerful. And I think in Drupal 8, Dave Snowbeck, a couple of people are starting to see that as Civi CRM is filling a certain space. It's the open source CRM space, which is a very specific space. Hard to sell to certain people. Not for profits, easy to sell. Salesforce is much better to sell for a profit.
That's a great side of it, is that, yeah, we're really good now at selling Drupal as the open source solution for your CMS. We're not so good as an industry right now at selling the open source solutions to the other areas right now. We still kind of default back to the proprietary solutions. You see that with kind of the shift of, well, Magento is a great example of the open source side, but like Demandware, Hybris, all those are still kind of very big. Salesforce, Marketo, all those sides of it, you're still defaulting back to them. So it's a great point. How do you kind of continue to shift back into leveraging open source not only for your CMS, but leveraging for your functionalities as well, like your CRMs, like your shopping carts, like your experiences.
What do you think of the YAML files in Drupal 8? They get used for configuration settings.
Yeah.
How does that compare to how you configure your site for it?
I didn't get deeply enough to really provide a good answer to that. I did deeply enough into AEM and Sitecore, so perhaps like if anybody else has experience with this.
Adobe and Sitecore definitely separate the content configuration very, very well. Drupal 8 has gotten much closer to that now. This is a way to look at that. Is how I look at that anyway.
Pulling out the database.
Yeah, in the past with Drupal 7, like you had everything in the database. You still have a lot of it there in D8, but you have that separation there you can at least fall back on. It's not as abstract, as Bill was mentioned earlier, with like the differing databases. And if you get into even the AEM level, where you have different servers even for your authoring experience versus your user or your actual public-facing experience, there's a clear separation there between them. Drupal doesn't have to that extent, but the YAML and the config management has made a huge strides in separating that out, and we've seen a lot of great improvements.
There is one thing I could add to that, and that is on the AEM side, again, you have a choice on how content is stored, being a NoSQL database or files, tar files. And if you choose the latter, files are versionable. So it makes that separation of configuration a lot easier.
Yes, I think the thing that you didn't touch on, I'm kind of curious to know more about is fixing, okay, open source, we have a bug security and it needs to be fixed. You have the security team, but then there's this workflow. Even getting things done in core, there's a pretty complex workflow. Issues can trail on to be 20 people commenting and making who makes the final decision, how the decision-making process of fixing security issues or features. It happens and it is successful. Yeah. But I am curious to see what that workflow is in the other systems and how fast you can get things done. And in some cases, people ask the question, well, can I throw money at the problem and get it fixed faster? And I'm curious if Adobe has that policy, like, you throw $10,000 and they'll fix something for you instantly, or get you a dedicated developer. In the Drupal community, it's just not as clear. Yeah. You can't. Yeah, I mean, Acquia has a certain amount of pull to do that, but there's a certain limit where they can't just go and fix something.
Yeah, I hadn't considered that question when I put together the presentation. But from your perspective, Dave, when talking with clients who might have looked at AEM or Sitecore and their turnaround time versus what could be accomplished in the open source community, have you seen an explicit difference?
Like a really good question, because we've drank in obviously the open source and Drupal Kool-Aid, probably everyone in the room, and I don't. It'd be interesting to research like what is the Adobe kind of governance when it comes to commits and patches and things like that. I will say one of the things I actually researched last year is that the I'll give one example, like United Airlines or a lot of airlines are now sort of crowdsourcing their technology and their code problems. So they may run a hackathon in a controlled environment where if you detect security breaches in their reservation system, they'll give you free Sky Miles, or which I think is a really cool concept. Like if you have more companies that start to see the value and like, hey, we can do this and give an incentive to folks to fix our problems, like that could be a trend that's catching on, you know.
Adobe says it's probably more than
Conversation Adobe starts at $1 million probably.
Okay.
I think, at a minimum.
I think the release cycles is also just an important comparison because Drupal was falling way behind on that.
Sure, sure. But with the new release method that in Drupal 8 and beyond now, that seems to be doing a lot better. Okay, looks like we need to break up, but I'm going to be in the media current room for the next hour if you have any further questions. Thank you again for attending. I appreciate it.